Robert Martinez stared at the empty dresser drawer where his passport used to be, his hands trembling as the reality crashed over him like a freight train. 7 days. That's all it took for his entire world to collapse. 7 days since he'd married the woman he thought was the love of his second chance at life. 7 days since Maria Gonzalez had whispered, "I do," in that small chapel in Las Vegas, her dark eyes sparkling with what he believed was genuine love and devotion. But now, standing in his bedroom in suburban Phoenix, Arizona, surrounded by the silence that had replaced her laughter, Robert understood the devastating truth. The woman who had called him her forever love, who had traced her fingers along his weathered cheek and promised to grow old with him, had vanished into thin air, along with his passport, his driver's license, his social security card, and worst of all, his faith in love itself. How does a 57-year-old man, a retired mechanic who thought he'd seen everything life could throw at him, fall so completely for a woman 30 years his junior? How does someone who spent 40 years fixing broken engines fail so miserably at recognizing when his own heart was being dismantled piece by piece? If you're watching this story unfold, wondering how someone could be so blind to the warning signs that seem so obvious now, I want you to hit that subscribe button. Because Robert's story isn't just about one man's heartbreak. It's about the dangerous intersection of loneliness, hope, and the lengths people will go to exploit both. And if you think this could never happen to you or someone you love, you might be more vulnerable than you realize. Robert Martinez had always been a simple man with simple dreams. Born and raised in Phoenix, he'd spent the better part of 4 decades working with his hands, fixing cars, building a modest life with his high school sweetheart, Patricia. They'd married young, bought a small house in a quiet neighborhood, and settled into the comfortable rhythm of middle-class American life. Patricia had been his anchor, his best friend, his everything. They'd tried for children, but it never happened, and somehow that just made their bond stronger. They were enough for each other. Every morning for 32 years, she'd pack his lunch and kiss him goodbye. Every evening, he'd come home to the smell of dinner cooking and her warm smile waiting in the kitchen. When the cancer came, it moved fast, pancreatic. The doctors gave her 6 months. She fought for 8. Robert spent every moment he could by her side, holding her hand through chemotherapy sessions, leaping in hospital chairs, promising her that everything would be okay even when they both knew it wouldn't be. She died on a Tuesday morning in March, 2022. Robert held her hand as she took her last breath, and something inside him died with her. The house became a mausoleum of memories. Her coffee cup still sat in the kitchen sink. Her reading glasses remained on the nightstand next to a half-finished romance novel she'd never get to finish. For 2 years, Robert existed rather than lived. He'd wake up, drink his coffee black because Patricia had always added the cream, go to his part-time job at the local auto shop, come home to silence, and repeat. His sister called. His few remaining friends invited him out. But Robert had built walls around his grief so high that nobody could scale them. Until the day his neighbor's grandson, Tommy, suggested he try one of those dating websites. "Come on, Uncle Robert," Tommy had said, using the honorary title he'd called him since childhood. "You can't stay alone forever, and Patricia wouldn't want that for you." Maria Gonzalez appeared in Robert's inbox on a rainy Thursday evening in October. Her profile picture showed a stunning woman with long, dark hair cascading over her shoulders, warm brown eyes that seemed to hold secrets, and a smile that could light up the darkest room. According to her profile, she was 27 years old, living in Manila, Philippines, working as a nurse at a local hospital. But it wasn't just her beauty that caught Robert's attention. It was her message. Unlike the generic "hi, handsome" messages he'd received from other women on the international dating site, Maria's first message was thoughtful, personal. She'd actually read his profile, commented on his love of classic cars, mentioned that her late father had been a mechanic too. "Hello, Robert," her message began. "I hope this finds you well. I read about your loss, and I want you to know that my heart goes out to you. I lost my mother to cancer 3 years ago, so I understand the emptiness you must feel. But I also believe that love doesn't end when someone dies. It transforms. And maybe, just maybe, it can bloom again in unexpected places. Robert stared at those words for hours before responding. When was the last time someone had spoken to him about love, about hope, about the possibility that his story wasn't over? He crafted his response carefully, telling her about Patricia, about his work, about the quiet life he'd built and lost. Maria's responses came quickly, filled with warmth and understanding. She shared stories about her life in Manila, her work at the hospital, her dreams of traveling and seeing the world. She spoke about her father's death when she was just 15, how she'd had to grow up fast to help support her younger siblings. Their conversations flowed like water, finding its natural course. Robert found himself looking forward to her messages with an anticipation he hadn't felt in years. She'd send him pictures of her day, selfies with patients at the hospital, photos of the sunset over Manila Bay. Slowly, carefully, she began to chip away at the walls he'd built around his heart. Within weeks, their conversations had moved from the dating site to WhatsApp, then to video calls. Seeing Maria's face in real time, hearing her voice with its slight accent and infectious laugh, Robert felt something awakening inside him that he thought had died with Patricia. The first video call happened on a Sunday morning, Robert's time. It was evening in Manila, and Maria appeared on his phone screen wearing scrubs, having just finished her shift at the hospital. Even exhausted, she was radiant. Her voice was softer than he'd imagined, musical in the way she pronounced his name. "Robert, it's so wonderful to finally see you," she said, her smile genuine and warm. "You have kind eyes. I can see why your Patricia loved you so much." They talked for 3 hours that first call. Maria showed him around her small apartment, introduced him to a roommate who giggled and waved at the camera. She made coffee and they pretended to have breakfast together, despite the 15-hour time difference that separated their worlds. As weeks turned into months, their daily calls became the highlight of Robert's existence. Maria would call him my love and my heart, terms of endearment that made his chest tight with emotion. She'd tell him about difficult days at the hospital, about patients she'd lost and saved. She'd listen with genuine interest as he shared stories about the cars he was restoring, the quiet routines of his solitary life. But there were red flags, tiny cracks in the perfect picture Maria painted. Sometimes her stories didn't quite line up. She'd mention working a 12-hour shift but be available to chat throughout the day. When Robert asked to speak to her family, she'd become evasive, claiming they were away or didn't speak English well enough for video calls. Most concerning were the requests that started small. First, it was $30 for medicine for her sick grandmother. Then it was $200 for emergency rent when her roommate moved out unexpectedly. Each time, Maria would cry on camera, apologizing profusely for asking, claiming she had nowhere else to turn. Robert sent the money without hesitation. After all, what was a few $100s compared to the joy Maria brought into his empty life? When she cried with gratitude, calling him her guardian angel, Robert felt more needed and valuable than he had in years. The requests grew larger, $500 for her brother's school fees, $1,000 for a medical procedure her insurance wouldn't cover. Each time, Maria's explanations were heartbreaking, her gratitude overwhelming, and each time Robert convinced himself that this was what love looked like, taking care of someone you cared about. By their 6-month anniversary of first contact, Robert had sent Maria over $15,000. His savings account, once healthy from years of careful living and Patricia's life insurance policy, had dwindled considerably. But Robert told himself it was an investment in their future together. Maria had begun talking about visiting America, about meeting him in person, about the life they could build together. "I dream about cooking for you every night," she would tell him during their evening calls. "I dream about waking up next to you, growing old with you. You've given me hope again, my love. You've saved me from a life of loneliness." Robert believed every word. How could he not? This beautiful, vibrant woman was choosing him, a middle-aged widower with calloused hands and a simple life. It felt like a miracle, a second chance at happiness that he'd never dared to hope for. Maria's request for financial help had become routine. She needed money for visa applications to visit the United States. She needed funds for travel documents, for new clothes to make a good impression when she met his family. Robert found himself taking on extra hours at the auto shop, dipping into his retirement fund, even considering a second mortgage on his house. When friends expressed concern about sending money to someone he'd never met in person, Robert became defensive. "You don't understand," he'd tell his sister Carol during their increasingly strained phone calls. "Maria isn't like that. She's genuine. She loves me." But late at night, alone in his bed, doubts would creep in like shadows. He'd replay their conversations, looking for inconsistencies, for signs that something wasn't right. But then morning would come, and Maria would call with her sweet voice and loving words, and all his doubts would melt away like ice in the Arizona sun. The turning point came when Maria announced that she'd finally saved enough money for her plane ticket. She would fly to Phoenix, they would get married, and she would apply for a spousal visa to stay permanently. Robert's heart soared. After 8 months of virtual courtship, his bride was finally coming home. He spent weeks preparing. He painted the guest bedroom that would become their bedroom. He bought new sheets, new towels, filled the refrigerator with food he hoped she'd like. He cleaned Patricia's belongings out of the master bedroom, a task that broke his heart but felt necessary for this new chapter of his life. The woman who emerged from the baggage claim at Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport looked like Maria, but something was different. She was beautiful, yes, with the same dark hair and brown eyes from their video calls. But there was a hardness in her expression that the camera had never captured, a distance in her smile that made Robert's stomach twist with unease. "My love," she called out, running to embrace him. But her hug felt mechanical, performed rather than felt. Still, Robert pushed aside his doubts. She was tired from the long flight, overwhelmed by being in a new country. Of course she seemed different. The first week was a whirlwind of activity that left Robert breathless and confused. Maria was nothing like the gentle, nurturing woman he'd fallen in love with over video calls. She was demanding, critical of his house, his neighborhood, his simple lifestyle. She complained about the heat, the food, the lack of excitement in his quiet suburban life. "This is not what I expected," she said one evening, looking around his living room with obvious disappointment. "In the Philippines, you seemed like a successful man, but this house, this life, it's so small." Before we continue with Robert's devastating discovery, I want you to pause and think about someone you love. Have you ever had concerns about someone they were dating or interested in? Have you seen warning signs that they couldn't see themselves? Leave a comment below and tell us about your experience. Sometimes the people we care about most are the ones who are hardest to reach when they're caught in someone else's web. And don't forget to subscribe to hear more stories like Robert's, because unfortunately his tale is far from unique in today's connected world. Still, they went through with the wedding ceremony. In a small chapel in Las Vegas, with just the officiant and 2 witnesses they'd hired for $20 each, Robert Martinez married Maria Gonzalez. She wore a simple white dress they'd bought at a department store that morning. He wore his best suit, the same one he'd worn to Patricia's funeral. As they exchanged vows, Robert searched Maria's eyes for the love he'd seen in their video calls. But all he found was impatience, a woman going through the motions to achieve a goal he was only beginning to understand. Robert woke up on the 8th day of his marriage to silence. Not the comfortable silence he'd grown accustomed to during his years of widowhood, but an empty, violated silence that made his skin crawl. He called out for Maria but received no response. Her side of the bed was cold, as if she'd been gone for hours. As he walked through his house, Robert's confusion turned to growing alarm. Maria's suitcase was gone from the closet. Her toiletries had vanished from the bathroom. It was as if she'd never been there at all, except for the emptiness that now filled every room like a toxic gas. His wallet sat open on the kitchen counter, emptied of the $300 cash he'd withdrawn the day before. But it was what he found missing from his bedroom that sent ice through his veins. His passport, the one he'd used for their honeymoon cruise that Maria had insisted they book for the following month, his driver's license, his social security card, his birth certificate, all gone. On the kitchen table, held down by the salt shaker Patricia had bought at a craft fair 20 years ago, was a single sheet of paper. Robert's hands shook as he read Maria's handwriting. "Thank you for everything. I'm sorry it had to be this way. Don't try to find me." That was it. No explanation, no apology that felt genuine, no acknowledgement of the 8 months of courtship, the thousands of dollars, the trust and love he'd given her. Robert sank into his kitchen chair, the same chair where he'd eaten breakfast with Patricia for 32 years, and felt something inside him break that was even more fundamental than grief. He called the police, but what could they do? Maria was his legal wife. They'd been married for a week. Technically, she hadn't stolen anything. She'd just taken what could be considered marital property. The fact that she'd disappeared was concerning, but not criminal. "Have you tried calling her?" Officer Martinez asked, the irony of sharing the same last name not lost on Robert. Maybe she just needed some space. But when Robert tried Maria's phone number, it went straight to a disconnected message. Her social media accounts had vanished. The email address she'd used to first contact him bounced back as undeliverable. It was as if Maria Gonzalez had never existed at all. The first few days after Maria's disappearance, Robert moved through his house like a ghost, haunting his own life. He'd lost more than money and documents. He'd lost his faith in his own judgment, his ability to trust his instincts, his belief that love could bloom again after loss. But on the fourth day, anger began to replace despair. Robert had always been a problem solver, a man who fixed things that were broken, and this situation, while devastating, was just another problem that needed fixing. He started with the practical matters. He reported his stolen documents to the appropriate agencies, applied for replacements, changed all his passwords, and monitored his credit reports. He discovered that Maria had attempted to open several credit cards in his name but had been unsuccessful due to security freezes he'd placed years earlier. The private investigator he hired was sympathetic but not optimistic. "These romance scams are incredibly sophisticated now," she explained. "The person you were talking to might not even be the woman who showed up at your house. They often use one person to build the relationship online and another to complete the marriage fraud." Through painstaking detective work, Robert learned that the woman who had called herself Maria Gonzalez was actually named Carmen Santos. She was part of an organized group that specialized in marriage fraud, using dating sites to identify vulnerable men who could provide the fastest path to legal residency. The photos she'd used in her profile belonged to a nursing student in Manila who had no idea her identity had been stolen. The stories about working at a hospital, about her sick grandmother, about her deceased parents, all carefully crafted lies designed to elicit sympathy and financial support. But the most crushing revelation was that Robert wasn't Carmen's first victim. The investigator found evidence of at least 3 other marriages in different states over the past 5 years. Each time, the pattern was the same: online courtship, request for money, a quick marriage, and then disappearance with important documents. The road back to himself was longer and more difficult than Robert had anticipated. The shame was almost unbearable. How could he, a man who'd successfully navigated 5 decades of life, have been so thoroughly deceived? How could he face his family, his friends, his community, knowing that he'd been played for a fool? For weeks, Robert isolated himself even more completely than he had after Patricia's death. He called in sick to work, ignored phone calls from his sister, let his lawn grow wild and his house fall into disrepair. The depression that settled over him was different from grief. Grief had honor to it, dignity. This was shame, pure and corrosive. But slowly, with the help of a therapist who specialized in fraud victims, Robert began to understand that what had happened to him wasn't a reflection of his stupidity or weakness. It was the result of sophisticated psychological manipulation by people who made their living exploiting human vulnerability. Loneliness makes us all more susceptible to believing what we want to believe, Dr. Sarah Chen explained during one of their sessions. These scammers are experts at identifying and exploiting the exact emotional needs their victims have. They study psychology, human behavior, the patterns that make people fall in love. You weren't foolish, Robert. You're human. Robert began attending a support group for romance scam victims. He discovered that he was far from alone. There was Margaret, a retired teacher who'd lost her entire pension to a man claiming to be a deployed soldier. There was David, a successful businessman who'd been convinced to liquidate his retirement account for a woman who needed emergency surgery that never happened. Each story was different in its details but identical in its emotional architecture. Lonely people seeking connection, master manipulators exploiting that need, and the devastating aftermath of discovering that love had been weaponized against them. Gradually, Robert began to forgive himself. He started returning to work, reconnecting with friends, taking care of his house and his health. He joined a hiking group for seniors, volunteered at a local animal shelter, began building a life that didn't revolve around the gaping hole Patricia's death had left in his world. 2 years after Maria, or Carmen, vanished from his life, Robert Martinez stands in his kitchen making coffee for one, but he's no longer the broken man she left behind. The counter still holds Patricia's salt shaker, and now it also holds a small photo of the hiking group that's become his chosen family. His passport has been replaced, his financial security restored, but more importantly, his sense of self has been rebuilt on a foundation of hard-won wisdom. Robert never saw Carmen again, never recovered the money she'd taken beyond the small amount insurance covered for the fraudulent charges. Law enforcement agencies in multiple states continue to search for her and her associates, but international marriage fraud cases are notoriously difficult to prosecute. She's likely moved on to other victims, other lonely hearts seeking connection in an increasingly isolated world. But Robert's story doesn't end with her victory. Instead, it transforms into something more powerful, a testimony to human resilience and the possibility of healing even from the deepest betrayals. He now volunteers with the same fraud victim support group that helped him heal, sharing his story with other people navigating the aftermath of romantic deception. He's learned to spot the warning signs he missed in his own experience: the request for money, the inconsistent stories, the reluctance to meet in person or speak with family members. Most importantly, Robert has learned the difference between love and loneliness. Real love, he now understands, doesn't require financial proof. It doesn't exploit vulnerability or feed on desperation. It builds rather than depletes, supports rather than demands, grows stronger with transparency rather than withering under scrutiny. If you're watching this story and you recognize yourself in Robert's experience, or if you're worried about someone you love who might be vulnerable to this kind of manipulation, know that healing is possible. Recovery isn't just about getting your money back or bringing the perpetrators to justice. It's about reclaiming your ability to trust yourself, to connect with others authentically, and to believe that you deserve genuine love and respect. Don't let Robert's story scare you away from seeking connection, but let it remind you that real love is patient. It doesn't rush you into financial commitments or legal arrangements. It doesn't exploit your grief or loneliness. It sees you as a whole person worthy of respect, not as a means to an end. Subscribe to this channel to hear more stories of survival and recovery, because while the internet has created new ways for people to exploit and deceive each other, it's also created new opportunities for survivors to connect, support each other, and share the wisdom that comes from walking through fire and emerging stronger. Leave a comment below and tell us, have you or someone you know ever encountered warning signs in an online relationship? Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to protect themselves or find the courage to seek help. Remember, there's no shame in being targeted by sophisticated criminals. The shame belongs entirely to those who would prey on the very human need for love and connection. Your story isn't over when someone tries to break you. Sometimes it's just beginning.